But hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. As Andy has said, this book that I'm talking about is called New Power. And I'm not an expert in global power structures. However, I did find this book really fascinating. I read it about 2 or 3 years ago. It was published in 2019. And I think it's still really relevant today because having worked in organizations or whatever culture and environment you belong to, what I do find is that this book helps to illuminate different value systems and different structures that exist, whether you're in a family or in a community or belong to a club or are observing governments or even within, obviously, the businesses that you work in. So I think that the first thing I jump into about the book as an overview is, if you go back to the overview, it's all about how we navigate and thrive in a world that is defined by the balancing of two big forces. One being old power, which he describes succinctly as a currency. So if we think of, say, a currency like the British pound, when you have currency, you want to hoard it, you want to hold on to it, you don't really want to share it, and that's how they describe old power. In contrast, new power is like a current. So electricity current or water current, it spreads, it's liquid, it's uncontainable. And, I think that's a really neat comparison of the difference between old power and new power. And I think the premise of the book is that in today's hyper-connected world, we need to channel the participatory energy of those around us and I suppose the liquid element of ideas, given the connected age that we're in. And I think that the important thing to emphasize is that this book doesn't say all power is bad and new power is good. But it says that if we want to continue thriving in the generation that we're living in, we have to start harnessing the elements of new power. So I think that the first point, it's this very neat table. And you can find, if you don't want to read the book, you can look up old power, new power values online, and you will come across some handy charts that illustrate the point of this book. And I like the headline that I've put in here, which is the difference between the lab is my world, right? It's contained. I live in a contained environment and, I'm kind of king of my lab, versus the world is my lab, which is the idea that you might harness ideas, resources, data from everyone around you and not just within a small contained environment. And if we kind of compare the blue side to the orange side, you can see there are words like, on the blue side, institutionalism, governance, managerialism, and it's kind of formal power, right? And if you go to the right, you have like informal, opt-in decision-making, environments where you don't just have one person deciding on how an organization is governed. And then if you go to the left again, on the blue side, this idea of exclusivity, authority, resource consolidation. And in contrast, on the right, you have open source collaboration, like Wikipedia, for example, crowd wisdom, sharing. And then I'll just go to the second last one around all power values being professionalism and specialization. I think, there is in many institutions, a desire and an emphasis on the professionalization and specialization of, qualities or of expertise. And, in some circles, this is absolutely necessary. If you were going to get a root canal done at a dentist, you really wouldn't want that to be crowdsourced, right? You would want a dentist to have the professionalism that's required to do a root canal in your mouth. But in contrast with new power values, it's all about do it yourself. It's about the maker and creator culture, which I think any of you who understand Gen Z or who have children of that age group, you will see that creator culture, maker culture, there is a belief that anything is possible with the technology that we have at our fingertips. So if you kind of summarize it here, it's a difference between currency and current. power that is held by a few versus made by many, systems that are closed versus systems that are open, systems that are run by command versus being shared, and of course, structures that are leader-driven versus peer-driven. So I think that's the first point about the difference between old power values and new power values. And I think once you start to grasp and, observe the differences here, I found for myself that it helped me understand how certain organizations worked and how certain leaders had a particular value system that might be in direct contrast to mine. So sometimes I would work with people now, I wouldn't understand why I couldn't convince them that a particular idea or a particular structure made sense and was good for the business. And it often was because we came from a completely different value system and kind of power dynamic mindset. So I think the second point here is all about a compass that the book illuminates to help us identify power structures. And the way that we read this, if you just focus first on the horizontal x-axis, which is all about values, right? And I think on the left, what they're saying is the left quadrant is all about old power values. And if you move to the right, it's about new power values. And if you look at the y-axis, which is the vertical axis, then it's all about structures and power models, right? And certain organizational structures, for example, employ more traditional power models versus those that are higher up the vertical axis have new power models. So to navigate this, what they've done is populate it with some examples of organizations and companies that they believe employ different power models. So if we look to the right-hand top right box, which is called crowds, this is the organizations or movements that employ new power values, which is all about, the current harnessing participatory energy, movements where ideas spread. And they also have new power models where it's completely peer-driven. You don't have a leader dictating the terms of the organization. So I think the most recent example of Black Lives Matter is a great one, where it really harnessed the participatory energy. And the people that started it were the people it intended to serve. Right? It wasn't someone at the helm of an organization who decided to start a hashtag and then co-opt lots of people to join them. So I think that would be an example. Many of you are on LinkedIn as well. LinkedIn is slightly closer to veering towards an older power model because it is owned by Microsoft, but it does harness the participatory energy of the peers that you find on a platform like that. And of course, Wikipedia is another great example. Now, I'm going to move to the bottom left quadrant, which is in direct contrast, and they call this castles. And, I think, reinforce the point that old power and old power values is not necessarily a bad thing. A company that fits in this box is actually Apple, right? I think many of us have an Apple phone. I personally, adore the brand. But if you look at their model and their organizational structure, it is very traditional. You've got one guy, the kind of key stalwart as the CEO running the brand. Even their office, if many of you have seen the design of the office, it's like a Fort Knox, it's a fortress. Not many people see through into it. You don't have transparency. Nothing is shared before a product launch until it is launched. Everything is shrouded in secrecy. You hardly see Apple employees sharing anything about their workplace on a platform like LinkedIn. And I suspect that their contracts are watertight, bulletproof, and they're not encouraged to employ this idea of radical transparency, right? So if you move on to the bottom right-hand side is what they call cheerleaders, who have they employ new power values, but according to old power models. So a good example is Patagonia. Many of you might be aware of Patagonia. It was started by this visionary founder, right? But the way that he ran the organization was like a traditional business. And, you know, they specialized in a particular set of clothing, and they had a strong purpose, but it was all very much under the guise of a traditional corporation. However, he and the company were very good at harnessing the participatory energy of their community and the crowd to join the movement of climate change, right? And they were very good at, I think, sharing transparently the behind the scenes of how their clothing was made, the supply chain that they employed to ensure it was sustainable, et cetera, et cetera. So there are ways to combine it. And then very quickly on the top left, which is the co-opters, is where you've got old power values, but in a new power model. So I think an organization like Facebook, you know, you could argue it really has a new power model because it is the largest participatory platform in the world. But you do have very traditional structures or value systems that run it at the same time, because it is still quite I suppose, dictatorial in its approach. You've got a core CEO at its helm, and you know they are not particularly generous in the way that they peer resource or crowdsource ideas. So you know that would be an example where you might think of it as, you know, a fairly modern industry leading organization, but they still employ fairly old power values. So if you go on to the third point, this just builds on the same compass, but talks about leadership archetypes. And it's the same for leadership archetypes. And I love this quote that I highlight here, which is the difference between a politician like Obama and how he ran his campaign, which won him the presidency, and then the guy that came after him, Donald Trump, and how he ran his presidency. And the quote from Obama was, "I'm asking you to believe not in my ability to create change, but in yours." And this idea is all about, you are the people who need to create the change that I want to see in this world. The power lies in you, right? And that is, I think, synonymous with cheerleader type leaders, where a person like Obama, you can see in the bottom right-hand quadrant, he employed new power values to, you know, invite the participatory energy of the crowd. Having said that, he was a president, right? And he still ran a fairly traditional governmental organization and institution. Now, in contrast, Donald Trump, you know, he would say, "I alone can fix it," right? And I think he's a very interesting example of someone who ran according to the values of new power model structures, because he was a president who was very savvy at harnessing the age of technology, right? The way that he used Twitter as a platform to co-opt a community and a crowd, the way that he used, I think, the media to reinforce and dominate the news on a daily basis. He knew how to harness the energy of social media. However, the way that he did it was ultimately in service of fairly authoritarian values, right? So this was someone who employed old power values, but harnessed the power of participatory platforms. And of course, you know, on the right-hand side, top right, the crowds, you know, this is someone that many people might not think of, but Lady Gaga is a celebrity who really knew how to employ the values of her community. And she called them little monsters. And she actually started a website called littlemonsters.com. And it was all about giving her fans a platform to connect with each other, to values that went beyond just their adoration of one celebrity. And the values that she wanted her community to share was all about inclusion. It was all about diversity. They were often people who were misfits of society, and, you know, giving them the confidence and the tools to say, we can belong even if we don't belong. And so I think from setting up the website, I think in the first day of setting it up, there were like 1 million people who'd signed up, and they were all people who identified with the values that she espoused, but not necessarily always to the music that she, sang through her albums. So then the fourth archetype is, or the fourth point is all about, new power participation scale. And this whole idea is all power behaviors are often about compliance and consumption. You do what we tell you to do. You consume what we ask you to consume, right? It's dictatorial. It's a one-way conversation. And the idea here, using this visual, is that if you want your ideas to spread, if you want to harness a community, if you want to create a crowd, then you need to start employing new power behaviors like sharing information, building affiliation, adapting your ideas, how to harness funding. There was a really interesting chapter about how new power funding happens, right? Whether it's a GoFundMe page or a Kickstarter, observe all the ways that people are starting to raise money, and how people, for example, are charging for the communities or newsletters that they share. These are ways now that the new generation are employing and harnessing power, right? And you have to produce content, for example, and you have to produce ideas, and then you have to get people to shape it with you, and you shape it for them, but it's a two-way conversation. And then the fifth and final point is all about the art of blending power. And I really like this idea that they talk about in the book, that once again, it's not that all power is bad and new power is good, but we have to find ways to integrate. And, when you look at, even if you're a leader, how do you lead, right? And if you do have a bias for old power models and structures, if you're, for example, someone who really believes in being professional and the expertise of the industry that you work for, you still have to think about, I think, how you invite participation and conversation in the world that we live in today. And I love this example to bring this to life, which is TED. I think everyone knows about TED, and the TED brand, which is a really powerful brand. And what I think a lot of people don't know is when TED first started as an elite conference, it was only one event that was held once a year, I think in Vancouver. That's where it started. And to attend a TED event or a TED a talk. And it often, I think, was like a 3-day talk. It was up to $25,000 per ticket. So it was hugely elitist and hugely inaccessible unless you were sponsored by your company or you had a ton of money. And of course, the talks that they curated were incredibly valuable and incredibly powerful, because the whole ethos was ideas that spread. However, when the new guy came on board to run the TED organization, he knew that, synonymous with the talks that were being shared, the landscape for today was changing, and there was a real thirst by the public to access these talks. So he did a very risky thing and put the talks online. And this was at the time a very controversial decision by the TED employees. They were very uncomfortable with the idea of putting the talks online. But when they did, each talk would start to be watched by millions of people, and they were shared by millions more. And it was a way to drive awareness and market the TED conference. And it still, at the same time, did not dilute the power and, I suppose, the prestige of the TED brand. In contrast, it actually made it much more desirable for people. So whilst people benefited from watching the talks, I think any of us would die to get a ticket to attend one of these TED conferences. And then they went beyond that, because what they found was that as more people got access to watching these talks online, there was a real thirst and hunger, as with the current participatory economy that we live in, people wanted to figure out how to do a talk themselves and how to, organize one of these conferences. So TED then opened up to what they call, I suppose you could call it a franchise of TEDx, and X stood for, independently organized events. So the picture I have there is of TEDx KL, which is Kuala Lumpur, which is the city that I come from in Malaysia. And I think it's been now organized in over 60,000 cities, TEDx events. And I think what's important here is whilst they opened up the TED franchise to cities around the world, they do have a very specific direction and instruction on the things that you have to adhere to in order to get approval to organize these TEDx events. So it's not that it's, anybody can run a TEDx event and can contribute. They still have a fairly directive, I suppose, manifesto, if you want to call it that, that ensures, independently organized events still adhere to the quality that the TED brand advocates for. And then finally, people, really wanted to translate a lot of the TED Talks because, so many people around the world wanted to watch it in different languages. And it started off as an English language event. So what happened was TED Translators was set up as a platform. And this was entirely peer reviewed, where people would upload their own translations. It would get peer reviewed to make sure that they were accurate. And then there would be a final step where someone from TED, who was an official translator, would then put their stamp of approval on the peer review translations. So once again, it's a blend of old power, new power, because you get peer participation and peer reviewing, but there was still a final check to ensure that it adhered to the standards that TED had. And I think this is a great example of a brand that can harness, I think, a fairly closed system structure, but still figure out a way to invite the participation and the community that we need today and that consumers hunger for in today's age. And I think in contrast, some of you might know of the World Economic Forum that happens once a year in Davos in Switzerland. And they're an organization that are really struggling to figure out how to open itself up to community. I think most of us don't really get to see what happens in Davos. You think of it as a bit of an elitist event that only really high-powered politicians and CEOs get to go to. And I think that's a really good example of an old power model with fairly old power values. But I know behind the scenes, they're trying to figure out how to modernize for the future. So I think those are my 5 points. It's all about currency versus current, that model of a new power compass and the leadership archetypes. I think once you read the book, and hopefully from this talk, you will start to observe people that you believe are more, crowd leaders versus castle leaders. And I think that once you observe the way that the best movements are formed or the best organizations find a way to blend two models, is one of those things that you can't unsee again. And it can be a really useful tool to figure out how to be more effective and more inspiring and more powerful in today's world. Thank you.